They laughed when he spent his savings on a rusted warship. 3 weeks later, nobody was laughing. A veteran bought an old Navy ship for scrap, then found something sealed inside the hull that changed everything. Robert Chen stood in the government surplus auction yard, holding his cashier's check for $5,000 while the scrap dealers shook their heads. The auction had just ended and somehow, against all logic, he had won the bid on the USS Hamilton, a destroyer that had been rusting in the naval boneyard for 43 years. David Morrison, vice president of Morrison Marine Salvage, didn't even try to hide his amusement. He leaned against his company truck, arms crossed, watching Robert sign the transfer papers. "You know that thing weighs 9,000 tons, right?" Morrison called out. "And you just bought it for the price of a used car. Hope you got a plan for moving it, old-timer." The other bidders chuckled. They had all been there for the metal. Thousands of tons of steel that could be cut up and sold. But the Hamilton was in bad shape, rusted through in places. Systems corroded. It would cost more to properly salvage than the metal was worth. That's why Morrison had stopped bidding at $4,000. It wasn't worth his time. But Robert had seen something during his inspection the week before. Something that made his engineering training from 50 years ago suddenly matter again. The ship's hull numbers painted along the waterline were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly off from what the official Navy documentation showed. To anyone else it looked like faded paint or a clerical error. But Robert had been a naval systems engineer in the 70s. He knew that hull numbers were never wrong. They were stenciled using templates, measured precisely, documented in triplicate. If they were off, even by inches, it meant someone had repainted them, intentionally, to hide something. As the crowd dispersed, still muttering about the foolish old man who wasted his retirement savings, Robert approached his purchase. The Hamilton sat low in the water, tied to a deteriorating pier in the government's ship graveyard. Seagulls nested in the gun turrets. Rust streaked down the gray paint like tears. But as Robert climbed the gangway and stepped onto the deck, something felt wrong. The ship settled differently than it should. It sat heavier in the water, lower on one side, like something inside was weighing it down unevenly. He made his way through the ship's interior, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The corridors were exactly as he remembered from his Navy days. Narrow, metal, covered now in decades of dust and bird droppings. Emergency lighting fixtures hung loose from the ceilings. Everything screamed abandonment. But then he noticed the marks. Scratched into the paint on the walls were numbers. Faded, barely visible, but there. They weren't standard Navy markings. They were coordinates. Internal coordinates. The kind engineers used to map modifications that weren't on official blueprints. Robert's heart began to race. He had seen marks like these before, a long time ago, on another ship, during a project that he had been ordered to forget. He followed the coordinates deeper into the ship, down 3 levels to the engineering spaces. The numbers led him to what should have been a ballast tank, a simple water tank used to help balance the ship. But when he tapped on the bulkhead, the sound was wrong. Too solid. Too thick. He searched the walls until he found it. A seam in the metal, barely visible, welded shut and painted over. But there, a door that wasn't supposed to exist. Robert pulled out his phone and called the only person he trusted, Lisa Park. She was an environmental engineer who had volunteered to help him with his dream project. He wanted to turn the Hamilton into a floating museum and community center, a place where kids could learn about naval history. It was a retirement dream that probably wouldn't work, but it gave him purpose. "Lisa," he said when she answered, "I need you to bring your equipment to the ship. The ground-penetrating radar, the thermal scanner, everything." "What did you find?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet, but I think there's a sealed compartment, a big one, and I think I helped build it 50 years ago." Lisa arrived 2 hours later with a truck full of scanning equipment. She was in her early 40s, sharp, and had a gift for seeing patterns that others missed. She had been the first to volunteer when Robert announced his museum project at the local Veterans Hall. They spent the afternoon scanning the bulkhead. The equipment painted a picture that made Robert's hands shake. Behind the welded door was a space roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, and inside that space something was drawing power. Not much, just a trickle, but consistent, like something on standby, waiting. "How is that possible?" Lisa asked, staring at her readouts. "This ship has been decommissioned since 1982. There's no shore power. No generators running. Battery system, Robert said quietly. Long duration. Maybe nuclear. We were experimenting with them in the 70s. Batteries that could run low-power systems for decades. Why would someone seal a powered system inside a decommissioned ship? Robert didn't answer. He was remembering. Project Clearwater, 1976 through 79. He had been a junior engineer, fresh out of the Naval Academy, assigned to a team developing advanced water purification for submarines. They had created something revolutionary, a compact system that could process seawater into drinking water using a fraction of the energy conventional systems required. The project had worked. Perfectly. Too perfectly. Robert remembered the day the Admiral had called them all into a conference room, told them the project was being classified above top secret, told them to forget what they had built, made them sign papers promising never to speak of it. 6 months later, Robert had been quietly reassigned. The rest of the team scattered across different bases. The prototype had disappeared. Robert had assumed it was destroyed. But what if it hadn't been destroyed? What if it had been hidden? Sealed inside a ship that was then decommissioned and forgotten? Can we open it? Lisa asked. Robert examined the welds. They were good. Professional. Military grade. It would take cutting torches, heavy equipment, days of work. So we get permits, do it properly, and alert everyone to what we found before we know what it is? Robert shook his head. No. If this is what I think it is, we need to be careful. There are people who wouldn't want this found. As if summoned by his words, footsteps echoed down the corridor. David Morrison emerged from the darkness, no longer smiling. Mr. Chen, he said, his voice flat. I've been thinking about our auction today. I believe I was hasty in stopping my bid. I'd like to make you an offer. $200,000 for the ship. Cash. Today. The number hung in the air. 40 times what Robert had paid. That's generous, Robert said carefully. But I'm not interested in selling. Morrison's expression hardened. I'm not sure you understand. The Hamilton is a navigational hazard. The Coast Guard is concerned. There are environmental issues, rusted fuel tanks, asbestos. It needs to be properly salvaged before it becomes a problem. I have 6 months according to my purchase agreement to either move it or begin restoration. Regulations change, Morrison replied, especially when the right people express the right concerns. Think about my offer, Mr. Chen. It expires tomorrow. Morrison turned and walked back up the corridor, his footsteps echoing into silence. Lisa looked at Robert. He knows something's in there. Yes, Robert agreed, which means we need to open it tonight. Lisa returned after midnight with cutting equipment borrowed from her contractor friend. No questions asked, just a favor owed and repaid. Robert had spent the evening studying the welds, planning the safest entry point. They worked in silence, the torch's blue flame throwing dancing shadows across the narrow corridor. The metal resisted at first, decades of molecular bonding reluctant to separate. But slowly, carefully, they cut through. The final section of the door fell inward with a heavy clang that echoed through the empty ship. Cool air rushed out from the opening, carrying a smell that made Robert stop. Not decay or rust or the mustiness of a sealed space. Something else. Clean. Filtered. Circulated. Lisa shined her flashlight through the opening. Oh my God. The compartment beyond was pristine. Where the rest of the ship showed decades of neglect, this space looked like it had been sealed yesterday. Gray walls clean and unmarked. A system of pipes and tanks arranged with mathematical precision. And in the center, a control panel. Its lights were dark, but Robert could see the faint glow of a standby indicator. Green. Patient. Waiting. Is that what I think it is? Lisa whispered. Robert stepped through the opening, his boots clicking on the clean floor. He approached the control panel slowly, like it might disappear if he moved too fast. The design was unmistakable. He had helped draft these specifications, had watched the prototype being assembled in a classified facility in San Diego. Project Clearwater, the system they had been ordered to forget. It's a desalination unit, Robert said, his voice tight, but not like modern ones. This design is 50 years ahead of current technology. It can process 100,000 gallons of seawater per day using 1/10 the energy of conventional systems. Lisa moved closer, her engineer's mind analyzing what she saw. That's impossible. Current desalination plants require massive amounts of electricity. They're one of the most energy-intensive processes we have. I know, Robert replied. That's why they buried it. He ran his hand along the control panel, reading labels he had last seen as a young man. Intake valves, processing chambers, output regulation, everything exactly as he remembered. And there in the corner, stamped into a metal plate, Project Clearwater, Primary Unit 01, Naval Systems Development, 1979. Why would the Navy hide technology that could solve water scarcity? Lisa asked. Robert sat down heavily on a storage container. Because it would have destroyed industries, changed power dynamics. In 1979, water rights were already becoming political. Desalination was expensive, which meant only wealthy nations could afford it. That gave them leverage. Control. He gestured at the pristine system. This changes everything. Suddenly, any coastal nation can produce unlimited fresh water cheaply. Desert regions become viable for agriculture. Water stops being a weapon. And all the companies, all the governments that built power around water scarcity, they lose their advantage. So they just buried it? Pretended it didn't exist? They classified it, sealed it inside a ship that was scheduled for decommissioning, scattered the engineering team, made us sign our lives away. Robert's voice carried decades of suppressed anger. I was 24 years old. I thought I was building something to help people. Instead, I helped bury the solution to one of humanity's biggest problems. Lisa was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. We need to document everything. Before someone tries to make this disappear again. Morrison already knows, Robert said. That's why he offered so much money. Someone told him to secure this ship to make sure nobody looked inside. Then we go public. Now. Tonight. Post everything online before they can stop us. Robert stood and moved to the main processing tank. It was larger than he expected, maybe 8 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter. Ceramic coated. Built to last. There's something else you need to understand about this system. It's not just efficient. It's self-sustaining. Once activated, it uses a fraction of its own output energy to keep running. Like a perpetual motion machine, except it's not violating physics. It's just that well designed. He pointed to a series of gauges. These batteries have been keeping the standby systems alive for 43 years. When I last saw this system, we estimated the batteries would last 70 years minimum, maybe 100. So, it could still work? Lisa asked. After all this time? Only one way to find out. Robert examined the control panel more carefully. The startup sequence was simple by design. Military systems had to function even when operators were stressed or injured. 3 switches, a confirmation button. That was all. His hand hovered over the first switch. If this works, if we activate it, there's no going back. Morrison and whoever hired him will know immediately. They'll come for this. Good, Lisa said firmly. Let them come. Let them try to explain why they've been hiding this. Robert flipped the first switch. Deep inside the system, something hummed to life. Pumps beginning to spin after decades of stillness. The sound was smooth, well maintained by the automated preservation protocols. Second switch. More systems activated. The control panel lights began to glow one by one, status indicators running through their diagnostic checks. Third switch. The main processor engaged. Water intake valves opened somewhere in the hull, drawing in seawater. The system began its work. The hum grew louder, more complex. Multiple processes running in harmony. Robert watched the pressure gauges climb steadily. Everything was operating within normal parameters, exactly as designed, exactly as it had 50 years ago. It's working, Lisa breathed. After 43 years sealed in a ship, it's actually working. A new gauge lit up. Output flow. It started at 0, then began to climb. 10 gallons per minute, 20, 50. The processed water had nowhere to go yet, cycling back into holding tanks. But the system was proving itself, proving that the technology was real, that it had always been real. Robert felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not quite pride, more like vindication mixed with grief. We were right. The project worked, and they buried it anyway. Heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, multiple people moving quickly. Robert and Lisa turned to see David Morrison standing in the doorway, flanked by 2 men in dark suits. Morrison's expression was no longer merely annoyed. It was carefully controlled anger. "Mr. Chen," Morrison said quietly, "I strongly suggest you shut that system down. Right now. Or what? Robert asked, his hand resting on the control panel. You'll make it disappear again? Classify it? Threaten me like you threatened me 50 years ago? Morrison's eyes narrowed. 50 years ago? What are you talking about? And that's when Robert realized. Morrison didn't know. Whoever hired him hadn't told him the full story, hadn't told him that the old man who bought the ship was Lieutenant Robert Chen, the engineer who had built what they were trying to hide. My name is Lieutenant Robert Chen, retired, Robert said clearly. Naval Systems Development, San Diego Facility, 1976 through 1980. Project Clearwater, Primary Engineering Team. And I'm not signing another secrecy agreement, not this time. Morrison's face went pale. He pulled out his phone and stepped into the corridor, speaking urgently to someone. The two suited men remained in the doorway, blocking any exit. Lisa moved closer to Robert. What do we do now? Robert looked at the system he had helped create, at the gauges showing it working perfectly after all these years, at the proof that they had succeeded and been silenced for it. Now, he said quietly, now we let it run, and we see who comes to stop us. Morrison returned 15 minutes later. His face was composed now, but Robert could see the tension in his shoulders. Whatever conversation he'd had on the phone hadn't gone well for him. Mr. Chen, Morrison began, his tone shifting to something resembling respect. I've spoken with my clients. They're willing to negotiate. They understand your historical connection to this equipment. They're prepared to offer you a consulting contract, $2 million over 5 years, in exchange for your discretion and cooperation in the proper disposal of this system. $2 million. Robert had been living on a naval pension and Social Security. The museum project was funded by his savings and small donations. $2 million would change everything. Proper disposal, Robert repeated. You mean burying it again? I mean handling classified military technology according to federal regulations, Morrison corrected. This system, regardless of its age, remains property of the United States Navy. Taking it without authorization is theft of government property. Lisa stepped forward. He bought the ship, everything in it. The deed is legal. The deed is for a decommissioned vessel. One of the suited men spoke for the first time. It doesn't include classified systems that were never officially decommissioned because they were never officially installed. The logic was circular, but Robert understood. If the system never officially existed, then it couldn't be officially transferred. And if he tried to claim it, they would argue he stole something that wasn't there to begin with. You can't have it both ways, Robert said. Either it exists and you have to acknowledge what you've been hiding, or it doesn't exist and you have no legal standing to take it. Morrison's jaw tightened. Mr. Chen, I'm trying to help you here. My clients don't want a confrontation. They want a quiet resolution that benefits everyone. But if you force this into the open, things will get complicated. Federal investigations, security clearances revoked. Your military pension could be reviewed. The threat was clear. Robert felt Lisa tense beside him. I'm 70 years old, Robert said quietly. My wife died 3 years ago. I have no children. What exactly do I have to lose that matters more than this? Morrison had no answer for that. Behind them, the Clearwater system continued its steady hum. The output gauge showed it was now processing at 30% capacity. In an hour, it would reach full operation. And when it did, it would need to discharge the processed water somewhere. Robert had been thinking about that. The ship's original freshwater tanks had been designed to hold drinking water for the crew. Those tanks were still intact, connected to the system through pipes that had been hidden in the original plumbing layout. When the holding tanks filled, the system would automatically begin filling the ship's water tanks. And when those filled, pressure relief valves would open. Water would be discharged overboard through the ship's original water outlets. Thousands of gallons of perfectly clean fresh water pouring into the saltwater marina. Morrison seemed to realize this at the same moment. How long until it starts discharging? About 40 minutes, Robert said. Give or take. Shut it down. No. Morrison pulled out his phone again. Then I'm calling the harbor master. This ship will be declared a hazard. The Coast Guard will seal it until proper authorities arrive. Good, Lisa said suddenly. She had been filming everything on her phone. Please call them. Call everyone. Because when they get here, they're going to find a 50-year-old desalination system that still works perfectly. And they're going to ask questions. Lots of questions. About why it was hidden. about who knew it was here, about what else might be buried in other ships. Morrison's hand froze over his phone. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Robert said, understanding dawning. The Hamilton isn't the only ship. You've been contracted to quietly salvage and destroy how many others? How many ships are sitting in boneyards around the country with sealed compartments full of technology that corporations decided was too disruptive to release? The silence that followed was answer enough. One of the suited men spoke into a radio. We need the team here, now. Full containment protocol. Containment, Lisa repeated. She raised her phone higher, making sure it was visible. I'm streaming this live to a private server. If this phone loses signal or if I don't check in every 30 minutes, everything uploads automatically to multiple news organizations. So whatever you're planning, you better make sure it looks good on camera. It was a bluff. She wasn't actually streaming, but Morrison didn't know that. Robert moved to the control panel and made an adjustment. The system's output capacity increased. The humming grew louder. I'm opening it to 70% capacity. At this rate, we'll hit discharge in 20 minutes. You're making a mistake, Morrison said, but his voice had lost its authority. My clients have resources you can't imagine. Legal teams, government connections. They will bury you in paperwork and investigations until you wish you'd taken the money. Your clients have been burying things for 50 years, Robert replied. Maybe it's time someone started digging them up. Footsteps echoed from above. Multiple people moving through the ship. Morrison's team arriving. But other sounds, too. Voices. Official sounding. The harbor master, probably. Maybe Coast Guard. Lisa had actually called them before they came to the ship. She told Robert this with a slight smile. She'd reported strange readings from the decommissioned vessel. Possible environmental hazard, possible fuel leak. They were obligated to investigate. Morrison realized this, too. His careful plan for quiet containment was falling apart. Last chance, he said to Robert. Shut it down. Walk away. You get your money, your museum, your quiet retirement. Everyone wins. Robert looked at the system he had helped build, at the gauges showing it working exactly as designed, at the proof that good engineering, honest work, and genuine innovation could survive decades of being deliberately buried. He thought about the young lieutenant he had been, full of idealism and pride in his work. He thought about the day they made him sign those papers, made him promise to forget, made him complicit in hiding something that could have helped millions of people. No one wins when we bury the truth, Robert said. I learned that 50 years too late. I'm not making that mistake again. He turned the dial to 100% capacity. The system responded immediately. The hum became a roar, pumps working at full power, processing chambers cycling at maximum rate. Within minutes, the first holding tank would fill, then the second, then the discharge sequence would begin. Morrison's radio crackled. Sir, we have Coast Guard boarding the vessel. They're asking about reported environmental hazards. How do you want us to proceed? Morrison looked at Robert, at Lisa with her phone still recording, at the system that was about to announce its existence to anyone paying attention. Stand down, he said into the radio. Then to Robert, you have no idea what you've just done. Yes, Robert said. I do. I'm finishing what I started 50 years ago. The first discharge came 22 minutes later. A fountain of crystal clear water erupted from the starboard side of the USS Hamilton, arcing 15 feet into the air before splashing into the marina. The sound was like rain, steady and strong, echoing across the quiet docks. The Coast Guard lieutenant who had been questioning Morrison about environmental hazards stopped mid-sentence and stared. What the hell is that? Robert and Lisa had come up to the main deck. Robert watched the water pour from the discharge port, catching the morning sun, creating small rainbows in the mist. That, Robert said, is 50,000 gallons per hour of fresh drinking water, from seawater, using less energy than it takes to run a household refrigerator. The lieutenant pulled out a testing kit from his bag. He was required to test any discharge from vessels. He collected a sample of the water, ran it through his field analyzer, then checked it again because the reading couldn't be right. This is fresh water, he said slowly. Not treated bilge water, not cooling system runoff. Fresh water, potable quality. Test it again, Morrison said quickly. Your equipment must be malfunctioning. The lieutenant ran 3 more tests. Each one confirmed the same result. The water pouring from a rusted warship that had been sitting dead in a boneyard for 43 years was cleaner than most municipal tap water. More people were arriving now. Harbor Authority, Environmental Protection. A fire department boat had been dispatched when someone reported the unusual discharge. Within 30 minutes, the USS Hamilton was surrounded by official vessels and curious onlookers. A woman in a Coast Guard captain's uniform climbed aboard. Her name tag read Martinez. She found Robert and Lisa on the deck. "Sir, I'm Captain Martinez. I need to understand what's happening here. Where is this water coming from?" "A desalination system," Robert replied. "Installed in 1979, never removed." Martinez looked at the rusted ship around her. "That's impossible. No battery system runs for 40 years. No desalination technology from the 70s could produce this volume at this quality." "You're right," Robert said. "No conventional technology could. But this wasn't conventional. It was revolutionary. That's why they buried it." Morrison stepped forward. "Captain Martinez, this vessel contains classified naval systems. I'm authorized to request that you clear all personnel and establish a security perimeter." "Authorized by whom?" Martinez asked. Morrison pulled out credentials. "Federal contractor, Department of Defense liaison, high-level clearances." But Martinez barely glanced at them. "Mr. Morrison, I don't care about your clearances. I care about a vessel in my jurisdiction discharging 10,000 gallons of water, and I need to know if it's a hazard. Everything else is secondary." She turned back to Robert. "You said this system was installed in 79. You have documentation?" "Better than documentation," Robert said. "I was there. I was part of the engineering team. Lieutenant Robert Chen, Naval Systems Development, Project Clearwater." Martinez's expression changed. She pulled out her phone and made a call. "I need verification on a Robert Chen, Lieutenant. Naval Systems Development, 1970s. She waited, then her eyebrows rose. "And what's his security classification?" Another pause. "I see. Thank you." She looked at Robert with new respect. "According to Navy personnel records, you still hold a top-secret clearance. It was never revoked. And you're listed as primary engineer on 3 classified projects, including one that matches this vessel's commissioning date." Morrison's face went pale. "Which means," Martinez continued, "that Mr. Chen has more authority over this equipment than you do. And unless you can produce a direct order from the Secretary of the Navy, I suggest you step back and let the man explain what we're looking at." Robert felt something shift in his chest. For 50 years, he had carried the weight of forced silence, of signing papers that made him complicit in burying his own work. And now, because of a bureaucratic oversight, because someone forgot to revoke his clearance when they scattered the team, he had standing. "The system below deck is a compact desalination unit," Robert began. "It uses a cascade membrane process with integrated energy recovery. The design was 15 years ahead of anything else at the time. It still is. One unit can provide fresh water for a small town. It costs almost nothing to run, and it's simple enough to maintain that developing nations could operate them." Martinez was recording now. "Why wasn't this technology released?" "Because it would have disrupted global water markets," Robert said. "Changed the balance of power. Made water abundant instead of scarce. And people who had built empires on scarcity didn't want that." A news helicopter appeared overhead. Someone had alerted the media. Morrison spoke urgently into his phone, but Robert could see he had lost control of the situation. Lisa touched Robert's arm. "There's someone else here you should see." An elderly man was being helped onto the ship by Coast Guard personnel. He moved with a cane, his face weathered, but his eyes were sharp. He wore an old naval officer's cap. Robert's breath caught. Harold? Captain Harold West, retired. The man who had commanded Project Clearwater. The man who had called them all into that conference room and told them to forget what they built. West approached slowly. When he was close enough, Robert could see tears on the old captain's face. "Robert," West said, his voice cracking. "I heard on the radio. The Hamilton, the water. I knew immediately." He paused, struggling with emotion. "I've waited 50 years to say this. I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry for what I made you do." "You were following orders," Robert said quietly. "Doesn't matter," West replied. "I should have refused. Should have gone public. Should have done something other than bury the best work any of us ever did." He looked at the water still pouring from the ship. "But you did it. You found it. You turned it back on." West reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn envelope. "I've been carrying this for 47 years, waiting for the day I could give it to someone." He handed it to Robert. "Documentation. Letters. correspondence between the Navy and private corporations, proof of who ordered the project buried and why. I was a coward for not releasing it myself, but maybe you can use it now. Robert opened the envelope. Inside were pages of official correspondence, orders to classify, recommendations to suppress, and signatures. Corporate executives, government officials, people who chose profit and power over progress. Captain Martinez was reading over his shoulder. This is evidence of conspiracy to suppress military research for private gain. This is prosecutable. Morrison made one last attempt. Captain, this is a national security matter. These documents are classified. Unauthorized disclosure is a federal crime. Then charge me, West said firmly. I'm 80 years old. I've got cancer. I'll be dead in 6 months. But at least I'll die knowing I finally did the right thing. The water continued to pour. The crowd continued to grow. And somewhere in Washington, phones were ringing as people realized that something they had buried 50 years ago was now in the light, witnessed by dozens of officials and broadcast by news cameras. There would be no quiet containment, no secret disposal, no making this disappear. Robert looked at the fountain of fresh water, at the proof that good work could survive decades of suppression, and felt the weight he had carried for 50 years finally begin to lift. The story broke within hours, not just locally but nationally. An old warship, a forgotten technology, a veteran who refused to stay silent, and proof of a 50-year cover-up. Robert spent the next 3 days in a media storm. Interviews, congressional inquiries, federal investigators wanting statements. But he wasn't alone. Captain West sat beside him at every interview, adding his testimony. Lisa provided the technical documentation, and Captain Martinez ensured that the Coast Guard's official report was thorough and public. Morrison disappeared after the second day. His company released a brief statement saying he had acted without proper authorization and was no longer employed. Nobody believed it, but it gave the corporations behind him plausible deniability. The USS Hamilton became a temporary sensation. Scientists from universities around the world requested access to study the system. The Navy, embarrassed by the revelation, initially tried to reclaim the ship but backed down when Robert's lawyer pointed out that classified systems cannot be transferred if they don't officially exist, and if they do exist, the cover-up becomes criminal. 6 months later, Robert stood on the deck of the Hamilton in the same spot where the water had first erupted into daylight, but the ship looked different now, clean, painted, restored by volunteers and donors who had rallied to the cause. The USS Hamilton was now officially the Clearwater Foundation headquarters, a working museum, education center, and demonstration facility. The original desalination system ran continuously, providing free drinking water to the community and serving as proof that the technology worked. Lisa had become the foundation's director. She had quit her engineering job to dedicate herself full-time to documenting the technology and helping developing nations build their own systems. The patents had been released into public domain after congressional pressure. Within 6 months, 12 countries had begun construction on clear water facilities. Captain West had lived to see it. He attended the Foundation's opening ceremony in a wheelchair, too weak to stand but determined to be present. He died 3 weeks later. His funeral was held on the Hamilton's deck, and his ashes were scattered in the water the ship now purified. Robert walked through the museum section now, looking at the exhibits. Photographs of the original engineering team, technical drawings, the actual control panel from the prototype preserved behind glass, and a wall dedicated to the cost of silence, estimates of lives lost to water scarcity, calculations of how many could have been saved if the technology had been released in 1979. A school group was touring, their teacher explaining how desalination worked. The children listened with the casual acceptance of a generation that couldn't imagine hiding helpful technology. One girl raised her hand. Why did they keep it secret? The teacher paused, searching for an age-appropriate answer. Robert stepped forward. Because some people thought controlling water was more valuable than sharing it, he said gently. They thought keeping it scarce gave them power. They forgot that real power comes from solving problems, not creating them. The girl considered this. That was dumb. Yes, Robert agreed. It was. After the tour left, Robert continued to the observation deck that overlooked the system's main processing chamber. Through reinforced glass, visitors could watch the cascade membranes at work, Seawater becoming fresh water through elegant engineering and simple physics. A man in his 40s approached. He wore a naval commander's uniform. His name tag read, Chen. "Uncle Robert," he said warmly. "Mom sent me to check on you. She says you're spending too much time on the ship." Robert smiled. His sister's son, following the family tradition of naval service. "I'm fine, David. Just making sure everything runs properly." "The system runs itself," David pointed out. "That was the whole point of the design, wasn't it? So elegant it barely needed maintenance. The engineering, yes, but the mission needs attention. We've had 3 more requests this week. Nigeria, Peru, Mongolia. Everyone wants systems now. We need to train more engineers. Need to establish quality standards. Need to make sure this actually helps people instead of becoming another thing that gets controlled and monopolized." David put a hand on his shoulder. "You've already done that. The patents are public. The designs are open source. You can't control what happens next, and you shouldn't try. You did your part. You brought it back to light." Robert knew his nephew was right. He was 71 now. His energy wasn't what it had been. The foundation had capable people. Lisa was brilliant and dedicated. The technology was out there, spreading, helping. But part of him couldn't let go. 50 years of carrying guilt made it hard to believe the work was done. "Did I ever tell you," Robert said quietly, "that I almost didn't buy the ship? I stood in that auction yard thinking it was foolish. Waste of money. Impossible dream. What changed your mind? I saw the hull numbers were wrong, and I remembered being the young engineer who helped repaint them, who helped seal the compartment, who signed the papers and walked away." Robert looked at the water flowing through the system. "I realized I'd been given a second chance. How many people get that? A chance to undo their biggest regret?" David was quiet for a moment. "You know they're naming the new International Water Treaty after you? The Chen Protocol requires all desalination technology to be shared freely between nations." Robert hadn't known. The news made him feel strange. Not proud exactly. More like vindicated. Like the universe was acknowledging that he had been right to turn the system back on. Right to refuse Morrison's money. Right to let the truth pour out like water from a rusted ship. "Captain West should have that honor," Robert said. "He's the one who kept the documentation, who had the courage to admit he was wrong." "They're naming the first African facility after him," David replied. "In Kenya. It breaks ground next month." Through the observation window, a new tour group arrived. More children, more teachers, more people learning that technology existed to solve problems, that corporate interest shouldn't override human need, that silence in the face of wrong was its own kind of betrayal. Robert watched them gather around the display, their faces bright with curiosity. These kids would grow up in a world where water scarcity was solvable, where the technology existed and no one could bury it again. "I think," Robert said to his nephew, "I'm ready to let other people carry this forward. I'm tired, David. 50 years tired. Then rest," David said gently. "You earned it. You built something that works. You brought it back when it mattered. You made sure the truth didn't stay buried. That's enough for one lifetime." Robert nodded slowly. He took one last look at the system humming steadily, doing the work it had been designed for, finally fulfilling its purpose after decades in darkness. Then he let David guide him off the ship, into the sunlight, toward whatever came next for an old engineer who had learned that the best work was worth waiting for, worth fighting for, and worth bringing back to life, no matter how long it had been buried. The USS Hamilton continued its work behind him. Water flowing, systems running, purpose restored. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again.